Leeds, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Northernlands 2, brought to you by ODI Leeds with the support of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We've put together a pioneering event which is bringing together innovators from the UK, mostly in the north, and the Netherlands as North Sea neighbours. We're experimenting, so please be kind, with a new type of online event where we're going to be learning new techniques, but also sharing everything afterwards as well, so everyone can learn from what we've been doing. I'd like to thank the ODI Leeds team because they've done an amazing job. So Amy Evans, Giles Dring, Stuart Lowe and Patrick Lake, you've done a fantastic job, thank you. You might also see Tom Forth every now and then popping up. So this morning we had a session, Open Data Saves Lives, which you can catch up with on our YouTube link later. That's all been recorded. And all the speakers are going to be separated so you can pick up the ones you want to catch up with. This afternoon is responsible data collaboration. Tomorrow is mobility in modern cities and also social interaction in a distance world, something we're all going to have to get used to. So, how does it work? So hopefully you're on our live page and you can see where we all are, you can see the chat. If you'd like to put a post-it note about who you are, where you're from and why you're here, that would be great. Let people know you're around. Please have a look in the check-in on the Docs Plus site as well, because that's a new way of trying to collaborate that we're looking at and hopefully we're going to contribute to as well in its development. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce Leica Koname, who's going to introduce herself and tell us why she's been collaborating with us.
Yes, hi, this is Leica Koname from the Dutch Embassy. First of all, I would like to thank everybody who was participating in this morning's session. I think it was extremely interesting. It all worked really well. So thank you all for that. Looking forward to another great session this afternoon about responsible data collaboration. We believe with another set of great speakers. So I can't wait to enjoy this afternoon too. And please, the last thing I would like to say, if you would like to contact us with any questions about how you could work in the Netherlands or work with the Netherlands, or if you want to be connected with the speakers or their organizations, please let us know, contact me or the embassy, and we will be sure that we can work together also in the future. So for now, enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks, Leica. So before we start, we've got an interview with Brekje Svakova, who's the acting embassy, sorry, I got distracted there. So she's the from the Dutch Embassy, and also Mr. G, who's going to kick off our session this afternoon. Okay, welcome everybody to Northernlands 2. This is the responsible data session, and I've got a welcome message from the acting ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Brekje.
Okay, thank you, Paul. My name is Brekje Svakova, and I'm the acting ambassador of the Netherlands Embassy here in London, and I'm very happy to be here with you today, this afternoon.
So the subject of responsible data, why is that important to the Netherlands?
Before I answer that question, Paul, let me thank you and through you, OD Leeds, for this excellent collaboration on these 4 seminars that we're running together. We really value that cooperation. And of course also thank the speakers of today for devoting a bit of their precious time to this. Your question, coming back to your question, why is this topic important for the Netherlands? It is important to the Netherlands because of the increased impact data collection and use is having on our society, in everything actually that we do. Data opens up a lot of economic and social opportunities, as well as bringing certain risks, of course, that need to be addressed and mitigated. And we see a lot of innovative use of data in our tech sector. And these innovations bring the much needed economic growth to my country. And the Dutch government would like to develop the economic and social opportunities that data gives, but also believes that this should not be done at the expense of the privacy of citizens and companies. And the discussion of this topic today are, as we all know from the media that we follow daily, are of course very relevant given the context that we live in, and timely, and will increasingly also be so.
Thank you. And so in terms of policies or thoughts, what, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, in February last year, the Dutch government published its digital data agenda, and it outlined actually 5 important steps towards digital data. First of all, solving problems with data. Secondly, paying attention to public values and legislation. Thirdly, improving the quality of government data and the efficient use of those data. Fourthly, to get more knowledge on working with data. And finally, the need to invest in people, organizations, and cultural change. And we find it important to work together with the private sector and academia when developing policies in relation to data use in society. And privacy will always be, for us in the Netherlands, at the heart of these policies.
Great. Well, there's lots of common thoughts over there how we're approaching this in the UK, and I think the opportunities and the risks we'd say we need to do in the open so that we can manage them in a better way. So, from your perspective, what are the role of Dutch speakers in this subject?
Well, I think the 2 speakers that we have today represent initiatives that show the importance of public and private organizations and initiatives working together on this topic. There's a lot to be done, and there's a lot of things that we need to be aware of. And Stefania will elaborate more about the constant critical look of data active at massive data collection when it comes to privacy and surveillance, but also social movements, activism, internet activism, internet infrastructure, and cybersecurity in the governments. And we find that extremely useful, and it helps us actually as government to shape our policies. And it will also be great to have Sander with us later, who will introduce the Future Internet Lab, which is an initiative that is focusing on things related to the Internet of Things. So big data, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and conducting research into the ethics actually of emerging technologies, models and algorithms. And initiatives like these keep the government of the Netherlands on its toes, and rightly so. We can only benefit from that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is personally close to our heart. As a friend of the UK, and with your unique insight about how we work and how you work, but also thinking about where we are in the north of England, what should we do next?
I think what we will see today is the like-mindedness of our 2 countries. We are, of course, geographically very close. We have historically very strong bonds and ties, and we have always cooperated. Also on science and things related, which started already a long time ago in the 17th century. And we hope that will continue into the future, also past next year. And that doesn't only go for the south part of the country, but obviously, and I think today shows that also the north of England, where you have your excellent companies, institutions like yourself, who can contribute to this development and discussions.
Fantastic. And as they say, we are North Sea neighbours. So yeah, we need to carry that going. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then as a final point, what would you like us to take away from this session, or what should we all take away from this session?
I think as our society rapidly becomes more and more dependent on technology and the use of data, it is of great importance that we work together, public and private organizations. We need to ensure that we inform the public and business and make policies about the use of data. And it is, of course, equally important, as I said before, that we don't do this in isolation in the Netherlands or in the north of England or in the UK, but that we do this together.
Fantastic, and yeah, absolutely. Radically open and also collaboration is definitely what we're all about. So thank you, and then we're on to the next session. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Mr. G. I want to give a big shout out to everyone in ODI Leeds. I guess we've got to do this conference remotely. It's a shame that I can't be there to meet you all. We had a great time last year, but I know that in the year to come, we'll all be meeting each other again. I want to give a big shout out to, everybody up north, man. I've been stuck down in London in isolation for so long. I've barely been up the road, let alone up the M1. So I want to give a big shout out to my people in Bradford, in Manchester, in Salford, in Leeds, in Sheffield, in Liverpool, the champions, and way, way, way up north to the Iron Brew crew in Scotland. That's Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Dundee, Fife. I want to give a big shout out to Huddersfield, to Middlesbrough, to Newcastle and Sunderland, the Tyne and Wear crew. I want to give a big shout out to my auntie in Harrogate and York, and last but not least, by the banks of the River Humber, I want to give a big shout out to Hull, because you are all northern stars shining high in those northern skies. And this poem is dedicated to all of you, and it's called A Land of Many Norths. We can become consumed by our own division, no matter how hard we multiply, to be another closed mind that simply adds to the subtraction of our times. Yet theories of accommodation require unlocking of conversations, adjusting for pause, pitch, and syntax to understand pronunciation, because the climates, they are a-changing. This is a land of many norths, a sky of many northern delights with northern stars to chart their course. For who should decide the laws, to procure the portals of our mind? Beyond the point of no return, to keep the bee, let's heal the hive. Let's be responsible for our own AI, as androids dream of electric sheep, as karma records our orbiting voices drawn into data's gravity. Let's be responsible for our own northern stories, to be told with bolder honesty, so the intangible value that lies within us connects with broader synergy. So can I learn from expertise in Leeds? Can I keep in touch with the Dutch? There's always something refreshing going on in Yorkshire, because let's face it, London water sucks. Is that being radically open enough? It might seem that I'm hacking my own closed London system, but the first step towards knowledge is to admit your ignorance. Nobody knows everything. Everybody knows something. The future's calling. So just listen. Thank you. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the conference. I've been Mr. G. Goodbye.
Welcome back. So hopefully you understand where we're coming from now. We're from Breccia and the acting ambassador of the Netherlands. And Mr. G, what a fantastic piece of work that is by him, the spoken word. So next up, we've got a session about responsible data collaboration. And first up is Lee Dodds from ODI HQ, who's talking to our friends and features our friends Open Data Manchester and Open Contracting Partnership.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Northernlands session on collaborating around data. My name is Lee Dodds. I'm the Director of Delivery at the Open Data Institute. I'm going to introduce the session, put a bit of context to the discussion, and then we'll hear from two speakers, Sam Milson from Open Data Manchester and Lindsay Masterson from the Open Contracting Partnership. So the question that we're considering in this session is, why is collaboration around data important in 2020 and beyond? Well, we're living in interesting times. We're dealing with a global pandemic, whilst being faced often daily with the issues and problems of unethical collection and use of data, all set against a backdrop of a rapidly changing climate. So we have some big challenges to face in our societies, in our economies, and in the environment. Data can help us to address those challenges, but only if we are open and transparent in how that data is being collected and used. and only if that data is fairly representing the communities that will be benefiting from it or be potentially impacted through its use. And we need to ensure that data is being used in responsible and ethical ways. And to do that, we need to collaborate. We need to work together to try and maximize the value that we can create by using data whilst minimizing its potential harmful impacts. And it's only through that that we will create a world where data works for everyone. So in this session, we're going to look at collaboration around data in two ways. Firstly, around collaborating on its collection and use, so collection and maintenance, and secondly, around its publication and use. So let's jump into the first of those, collaborative maintenance. Now, when we're typically introducing open data, we focus on the definition that open data is data that anyone can access, use, and share. And while that is true and useful, it doesn't get into the practice of open data, which even in 2020 is still largely around public and private sector organizations publishing data that they have already collected. So increasing access to it to allow others to use the data in new ways. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can work together to collect and maintain data. And there are many projects that exist that have explored that approach. So I think it's important to recognize that, that collaborative maintenance is an option, that communities can work together to collect and maintain data, which is then made available under an open license. When we look at the kinds of work that is involved in maintenance, it turns out that we can share quite a lot of it. We can decide on what data should be collected in the first place and how it should be stored and managed. We can share the work of collecting and maintaining the data so it maintains its use and value over time. We can work together on managing access to data and improving its quality. And we can collaborate on building the tools and the communities that can help us to unlock value from that data set once it's been collected. So there's a range of different activities we can be involved with. So let's look at a few brief examples. So the first, perhaps most widely known, is OpenStreetMap, which is a very successful collaborative maintenance project. Within OpenStreetMap, one particular initiative is the humanitarian OpenStreetMap project, which brings together local mappers working on the ground with remote mappers working with satellite imagery to help to improve responses to disasters around the world. By working together, those mappers can rapidly update and improve the map in areas where humanitarian aid is needed to ensure that aid is directed in the most useful and most impactful ways. Another example would be the Mozilla Common Voice project, which is a project to try and develop a more diverse and representative data set that can support the development of voice recognition applications. So the project encourages people to contribute their voice to the data set and get involved in transcribing recordings that have been contributed to it. The third example we can look at is the work of Open Data Manchester in Stockport. So let's hear from Sam Milson about that project.
Hi, I'm Sam. I work for Open Data Manchester. We're a not-for-profit formed from a diverse group of open data advocates back in 2010, and we support organizations to release data and we help people to use it. We build and support good data practice through expert advice, advocacy, events, research, that sort of thing. So back in 2019, part of the ODI's OpenGIS call, we ran a project which we called Mapping Mobility Stockport, which was a program about trying to map the experience of people with mobility and accessibility impairments, looking at the routes and the strategies that they used to travel in and around Stockport town centre. Quite often, these sort of communities can be overlooked in town planning, and whether that's because the urban environment deteriorates over time or just doesn't account for their experience. So it could be things like not having dropped curbs at the pavement at busy crossings, for example. These things historically can be overlooked. And again, moving forward in terms of planning and redeveloping the town centre, quite often, again, these things are quite hard to sort of map and to take into account, often because the GIS systems themselves they have a very sort of basic way of describing these things like dropped curbs or tactile paving, but they don't take into account the vast range of experiences that people have. So they don't often might not take into account, quite acute neurological conditions, for example. So how do you sort of plan for that? So with Mapping Mobility Stockport, we had some funding from the ODI in which we sort of developed a methodology for capturing and mapping this data. So we worked with Stockport Town Centre and some community groups in Stockport, so Disability Stockport and also Age UK Stockport. And we ran some workshops with them where we got maps of the town centre from the council, and we literally just started scribbling on the maps the routes that people took to get where they needed to go around the town centre, and started to identify problem areas, but we also started to identify the routes that people took regularly, because quite often people do have their own routes and strategies to move around the town centre, but these kind of remain tacitly within those communities. So it was a really good exercise for us and for Stockport Council to be able to actually map these routes and to think about, why do people take these routes? Why not this particular route when it's more direct? Maybe because there's, it's too steep for a wheelchair to pass down safely, that kind of thing. So it was a really, really good exercise for Stockport Council, because they were redeveloping doing a lot of redevelopment of the town centre. The bus stop they are currently redeveloping. So a lot of the experiences of the bus station area, some of the information that we captured has fed directly into the redevelopment of the bus station, so making it more accessible. With the workshops themselves, we started off doing workshops where we just scribbled down problem areas, but then we also went out onto the streets and conducted walkabouts, one-on-one walkabouts with people. So wheelchair users, people with visual impairments, elderly, and literally just walked around and with a dictaphone and taken photos, and we just took the routes that they took and got them to describe their experience. And in the end, we were able to build a sort of actual digital map of these routes and of the good areas and of the problem areas. And as I say, the project was really, really successful. Stockport Town Centre, have used the data that we captured and mapped in the redevelopment of their bus station. But actually moving forward, at Open Data Manchester, we've been thinking about how can we capture these experiences, because there are so many more experiences. And I think that a lot of GIS systems don't have the language or the structures through which we can describe these experiences. Quite often you're looking at urban areas from the point of view of the buildings or from the streets, rather than the experience of the human being, the embodied experience of the human in that space. So from the Mapping Mobility project, what we're hoping to do is we're actually going to take the data that we collected with these groups and start to build a framework, a sort of really basic, I suppose, trying to look at, can we create a sort of basic standard for describing experience? So describing and mapping areas from the human's perspective. And from that can also incorporate a multitude of different experiences. So we're actually hoping this year to start developing that project further. So taking the data and the stuff that we collected and developing a kind of prototype, whether that's going to be a questionnaire or some kind of standard. We're going to sort of hopefully work on that and develop it further, and to see whether we can, create a kind of a standard or a framework for capturing capturing more people's experience of moving around urban areas, which we think could make town centres, city centres much more inclusive and just a lot safer and easier for all people to move and travel around and live in.
So thanks, Sam. What's really interesting to me about that project is not only were they able to create some local impact by working with the local community on collecting missing data, it's also led to some reflections about better ways to collect data in future, so that it's more representative of those communities. And that's something that we're really interested in at the ODI. We recently published a guidebook to help people design and build systems and tools that will support collaborative maintenance. We'd really love to get some feedback on this, so please take a look and let us know what you think. So let's move now on to the second way in which we can think about collaboration. So collaborating on the publication and use of data. And again, I think it's illustrative to look at what is happening in the open source movement and think about how we might apply that to open data initiatives. So some of the more successful open source projects have recognized that in order to be impactful, they need to get people to contribute more than just code and bug fixes. They need a wider range of skill sets. They need people to help produce documentation. They need user researchers to make sure that the software is well designed. They need designers to help improve the user interfaces and the user experience of using those tools. So there's been a move to try and get more people involved in a whole variety of different ways. I recently came across this framework called BaseDef that had been developed by a number of people in the open source community. It tries to spell out a variety of ways in which we might contribute to an open source project and in helping it achieve some impact. So we might blog about it to help other people understand how it could be used. We might try it in a project so that we can provide useful feedback about how it might be used. We can file bugs, we can contribute bug fixes, but we could also just work to try and improve the documentation to help other people, perhaps with less technical skills, to get some value from the software. Now, what if we applied the same framework to open data? We could write about new data sets as they're published to help others to understand both the value of the data, perhaps also its limitations. We could write tutorials and produce code that can illustrate how a data set can be used, perhaps to show how it could be used in specific tools or to answer specific types of questions. We can give feedback to the publisher, maybe to suggest how they could improve how the data is been published, perhaps to align it better with other data sets or to adopt a specific set of standards. And through the freedoms that are given to us by open licenses, we can enrich and improve those data sets, perhaps to add in additional data or to link it with other sources. And increasingly, we need to make sure that data is well documented. So we can all contribute to that. We can help to fill in the gaps and support publishers in making sure that their data is well described and well published. Increasingly, there's a range of open data initiatives that are realizing that this kind of broader support is necessary in order to achieve impact. One example of those is the Open Contracting Partnership. So let's hear from Lindsay about the work that they've been doing.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Marchessault, and I'm the Director of Data and Engagement at the Open Contracting Partnership, where we support governments and other stakeholders around the world to improve their public services by improving their public contracting. Public spending on contracts adds up to more than $10 trillion of public investment per year, so it's very important to get it right. And by that, I mean value for money for government, fair access to opportunity for business, and high quality goods, works, and services for everyone, which includes everything from buying textbooks to maintaining power plants. Unfortunately, in many cases, we don't have the data that we need to ensure an effective procurement process or to diagnose the performance of the system as a whole. These data challenges might be because the data is not collected, not digitized, or because of poor data quality. And usually there's an element of collaboration in this. I'll give an example. Currently, in the COVID-19 emergency response, many governments are currently purchasing or have purchased ventilators. And the process to effectively buy ventilators involves a lot of needed data as input. This includes understanding what is our current stock and supply of ventilators, where are the ventilators functioning, are they the appropriate ventilators that we need? What do we expect in terms of the amount of ventilators that we need and when we're going to need them and where we're going to need them? What are our best predictions and our best advice? Finally, what do we know about the market for ventilators and where are they available? What are our market reference prices and who might be able to supply these things? Without the process to understand and collect this data, digitize it, and use it effectively, the quality of the procurement outcomes will be affected. And that's just one example of how data is important in all different types of public purchases at all different stages, whether that's the planning of the procurement process itself, or how we want to effectively manage that contract delivers value for what was needed and intended. So this situation is why we support partners to collect, publish, improve, and use open data about the planning, procurement, and implementation of public contracts. And to do this, we maintain a variety of tools and guidance, most notably the Open Contracting Data Standard. And we provide both policy and technical advice, including on change management strategies. And we also provide a free global help desk for the Open Contracting Data Standard in both Spanish and English. Over the years, we've supported hundreds of partners from dozens of countries, and we are working to build an international community of open contracting practitioners. And one thing that we've learned is how important multi-stakeholder collaboration is to achieving measurable results. Collaboration has been even more important in 2020 as the entire open contracting community has focused on ensuring the effectiveness and accountability of the COVID-19 response procurement. So this is to ensure we have the necessary medical equipment, facilities, and services to address the crisis. And I'll share one example. The government of Paraguay, through their procurement agency, wanted to ensure transparency of the COVID-19 emergency purchases. Because of the emergency, government agencies were allowed to buy quickly without competition, without an advertised process. But just because something has to be done quickly doesn't mean that it can't happen with accountability. And so our help desk advised them on how they could use the Open Contracting Data Standard to identify the COVID-19 related procurement and ensure that it was referenced to the COVID-19 emergency budget lines as well. Our engagement leads for Latin America also worked closely with the government and users of the data to ensure that the data was being presented to people in a way that they could use it. And one way that this happened was by a tool developed by the Inter-American Development Bank that we advised and supported on, which reused the data and combined it with other information, including budget, geographical data, in something called an investment map. And the data included information on the buyers, the prices, the suppliers, and information about the items and services being purchased and their delivery. And this data is being used by a wide range of stakeholders within the country, including the government to improve their own processes, by business to understand the market and the opportunities, by civil society, academia, and media. In fact, journalists have reported about several irregular procurements in the media, including a case in which large volumes of tonic water were purchased at roughly 5 times the market price as a COVID-19 emergency procurement. And as a result of this case coming to light, the government issued a new requirement that buyers must report and publish their market reference prices to justify the prices they're paying, which will hopefully avoid other inflated emergency procurement. So at the Open Contracting Partnership, we're also supporting similar efforts to publish and use procurement data all around the world, some specific to the COVID-19 response, but also starting to prepare for the coming spending associated with the economic recovery. And for example, we recently launched an action research program where we're supporting researchers from 12 countries to use data and investigate the effectiveness, integrity of the COVID-19 emergency response procurement. And we hope that their findings will lead to similarly actionable policy recommendations, which can be implemented through collaboration with government. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions about our work, our tools, or our support.
So thanks, Lindsay. Again, I think that there's something really powerful there about demonstrating how by bridging between the publishers and the users of the data, the partnership has been able to increase the impact, increase the value that has been gained by sharing that data in the first place. So to return to our original question, why is collaboration around data important in 2020 and beyond? It's because we need to work together to get more people involved in understanding how data is being collected, get more people involved in maintaining that data over the long term so that we have a stronger data infrastructure. And we need to work together as communities to make sure that we can maximize the value of that data while minimizing its potential harmful impacts. And through that work, we can create an open, trustworthy data ecosystem. So thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the work of our speakers or the work that we have done at the ODI, then please follow the links in the slides. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. And I'm really happy to be joined by Lee Dodds and Sam Milson from Open Data Manchester. We've got a couple of questions for you, and then we'll have a little bit of a chat, and then we can move on to the next talk. So the first question we've got in the chat, Sam, is some fantastic work you've been doing there. Have you got any contacts or plans to do that in other international cities?
Oh, that's a good question. So, I mean, at present, we have only been based doing the work in Greater Manchester. Although, as an organisation, we obviously do collaborate nationally and internationally. But the mapping project itself has only been Greater Manchester so far. We have had conversations with organisations such as the Tasker Centre for Accessible Technology. I think they're based over in Seattle. They've created amazing access maps of cities like Seattle. So we've been having conversations with them about potentially developing it and collaborating further. So at the moment, no, only Greater Manchester, but we're definitely looking to further develop it. We're specifically looking at ways to, I guess, try and find ways if we can standardize the mapping of these experiences, which will make it easier for other organizations and cities to pick up and scale such mapping. That said, I mean, all of our materials and methodology is actually available openly on our GitHub. So if anybody just wanted to sort of pick it up and have a look and try it themselves, they can do. And very happy to share that and have a chat with anyone who's interested. Yeah. Fantastic.
Well, if you could drop a link into the chat, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
And then maybe drop it into the Docs Plus. That would be fantastic. So,
cool.
Lee, I guess this question for you is, and this question always comes up, is as well as the positive impact, how do we manage potential harmful impacts of the work we're doing around, and people start to think about artificial intelligence in this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really big question to wrestle with this afternoon. So I'm gonna narrow it a little bit and think about the collaboration aspect. So how can we collaborate to help mitigate those risks? I think there's two things that I'd maybe call out. One I touched on briefly in my intro, which was if we can mitigate some of the risks of use of artificial intelligence by making sure that the data that it draws on is of decent quality. And increasingly, that means that it's representative of the people that might be impacted by it or might be using it. So making sure that we have representative, diverse data sets so that the results that we get from applying artificial intelligence are better and are better suited for the communities that they're intended to support. And then I think the other thing is how can we collaborate or work with communities so that they feel comfortable about when artificial intelligence is being used to support them or make decisions about them. So there's a whole role there for different forms of kind of collaborative governance, citizen councils to kind of review systems before and whilst they're in operation to help really kind of review the kinds of decisions that are being made using that technology and see whether they're fit for purpose.
Okay, we've got another couple of questions that have come through, mainly for you, Sam. So we've got standardization frameworks, standardization institutions. So you've got, I don't know if you saw that we gave Ben Goldacre 47 seconds to talk about re-anonymization this morning, and he spent 6 minutes talking about it. So I'm going to give you 47 seconds as well to talk about some of the standardizations issues around frameworks and the work you've been talking about there.
Yeah. So, well, what we're planning on doing, actually, hopefully in the next year, really, is a project to, I suppose, we're fully understanding that when you're talking about mapping someone's experience of getting around, the streets, there isn't going to be a one size fits all. But I guess you have to start somewhere, right? So, we're actually planning on kind of taking more people out on sort of walkabouts and mapping their experiences, a bit like I sort of said the Stockport project, and then through that working with a sort of socio-linguistic linguist to help sort of see whether there are kind of shared ways that people experience certain things. If there is sort of if there is a kind of shared framework, and kind of the idea is to sort of create a basic prototypal framework that we can then test and iterate. Now, being aware that this is actually we're hoping to do this in Manchester, working with sort of marginalized communities. So we're very aware that it's going to just be a very sort of specific location and a very specific background. But then the idea being that the methodology that we develop with it will also be scalable. It will obviously be an open source project. So the idea is that we would invite people to contribute and add to it, take the project on themselves and develop it. Yeah. That's really, really quickly how we plan to start doing it. Yeah.
Well, no, that's a great question. And I think we all agree that start first with the right direction and build and iterate quickly is absolutely the right way. The last thing we need to do is set up another working group to decide on a platform and a standard that might not be applicable to actually what people need. So yeah, great. I'd just like to finish off and firstly say thank you so much for joining us and in this session. But one of the things we've found, especially in the pandemic, is that the number of questions we have from people who expect us just to have the data in the right format that can be deployed for whichever platform or whatever tool is being used. And how do we move from, I guess, seeing this work around data standards and planning and maintenance and responsible collaboration, and how do we make that the mainstream and the first thing that people think about rather than the last thing that people think about when they're doing a project? So I'll start off. I think the main thing is that we should use the existing. There's so many tools that already exist that we could mandate. So why, when people are, for example, all of the infrastructure that you were mapping in Stockport, Sam, that's all on an as-built drawing that could be easily uploaded to OpenStreetMap and deployed, and then we've got a resource that everyone can use, and that should be no extra work for anyone involved in that supply chain. The hard infrastructure could be mapped, placed on OpenStreetMap, and then as a resource to use for everyone. So that's some examples we have. But Lee, how about you first?
Well, totally agree with you. We should be making better use of existing platforms and communities as much as we can. helps bring a focus on kind of maintenance of those things rather than just trying to create something new. I think the other thing I'd add, though, is so it's recognizing that creating impact from around data, it's a team sport. We hear lots about data scientists and increasingly about data engineers, but we don't really hear about all of the other roles that are part of creating impact from data. You know, the engagement, the communications, the community management. We need to recognize those and bring those more to the fore, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam?
Yeah, I agree with all of that, but I think also it's about giving people the tools. Well, giving people an on-ramp. I think a lot of people still quite afraid of the word data, and it is something that other people do over there. And I think at the moment we're finding a lot more people are having to digitally engage with data. I think it's also about giving people the confidence with data, and I think sometimes it's just about demystifying it a little bit, going back to basics. People are often more capable than they realize, but I think there's perhaps still a slight fear of the word data. So it's kind of something that other people do over there. And it's about bridging that gap, I think.
Yeah. And most people can use Excel. And, you know, for most projects, Excel will get you a long way in understanding what's going on. So Excel and some YouTube videos to explain things.
Yeah.
You know, that can go a long way. We don't have to go and get doing things in the command line and getting R out too early. So thanks very much. It's been amazing. Thanks very much for joining us. Our next session is checking the agenda. There we go. So we've got Stefania Milan, who's going to talk about her 4 principles for responsible data collection. So this was a different talk this morning. We've uploaded and done a new video. So this is on the hoof work, and we're going to head over to Stefania now. Sander? Okay, so I got all that wrong. So it's Sander van der Waal who's going to talk about how to empower citizens through collective measurement in their environment. Stefania is just after tea. Okay, cheers.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this session on how to empower citizens through collective measurement of their environment. My name is Sander van der Waal and I work at WAAG, a public research institute in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. We developed a roadmap for the digital future for the Dutch Parliament, and I will take you through this model and explain how we adapt it onto a project that we're running specifically with citizen science and smart citizens. So this is the building where we're based out of Amsterdam, and we're a research institute that focuses on the role of technology in society and have done so over the last 25 years. We do a lot of research on how to make sure that the technology that we rely on day to day is built on public values and ensures the delivery of a public mission. What we see today when we as citizens encounter technology is often only the tip of the iceberg. And on this top of the iceberg is what we call the citizen perspective with regards to technology. You only see the device that you hold, you see the apps that you have on your phone, you see the applications that you use on your laptop. But underneath the surface, there's a whole technological stack that is made up of different layers that all are part of making sure that the technology functions. When you go even deeper, you realize that there is a design process underneath all of this. The design process is how the technology has been developed. It was never created just out of thin air. There have been people and organizations involved designing and building the technology. And this is true whether you're talking about an app that you download or whether you talk about the doorbell that is connected through the internet so you can see who's at the door. All the technology we rely on has been designed and built by people. Now, and if you go even deeper to the bottom layer of our little iceberg, you get to the foundation. Because even the processes by which the technology has been designed and delivered, they are not coming out of thin air either. There are lots of different ways in which different organizations have been involved. There's a legal context within which the technology is being developed, and there are ways in which different people are trying to pursue specific goals. For example, a big technology company like Facebook wants to make as much money as possible by selling advertisements. So their motivation is to sell ads to you as a user of their product. There may be other organizations like governments that are deploying platforms to engage their citizens. They may have different goals, but how do you ensure that those platforms that are being developed within this public context are actually meeting those kinds of needs and are embedded on this foundation which respects the public context in which the governments operate? Now, once you've seen the different layers of our little iceberg, you can imagine that there are different ways in which you can construct this foundation on which the design process has been built. And what we'll do in this presentation is to go through these layers and build the iceberg up on a foundation in line with public values. And this is what we call the public stack. But before we do that, we want to do it by using a very specific example. And this is where the smart citizens come into play. Because there's a project that we run at WAG which looks at air quality and air quality monitoring. And we're doing this as part of our work around the smart city, where we say it's not about the city being smart, it's about the citizens being smart. So my colleagues at the Smart Citizens Lab are building sensors and working with citizens to help them measure their own environment, thereby gaining knowledge and increasing their sense of control of their environment. You can see some examples here around air, noise pollution, and water quality, which are 3 projects in which we deploy these types of sensors. And the one I'm specifically focusing on with you today is the one called Hollandse luchten, which is the Dutch term for Dutch skies. And it's a citizens platform to measure the air quality within the region around Amsterdam, where there's a lot of air pollution from a steel factory, for example, and citizens are concerned about that level of air pollution. So what we did with them is to help develop a sensor kit. And the sensor kit contains different sensors, which are all sort of easily constructed into one. And indeed, the citizens themselves can be part of that process and help construct the sensor kit themselves. So thereby they will be able to measure the air quality. So there's NO2 in there's different other factors of air quality that are being measured. And what we do is we're deploying those within this region, and there are about 200 right now that are being deployed, and citizens are using these sensors to measure what the state is of air quality. So rather than being involved in some sort of abstract debate about the quality of air around them, they can actually get the figures themselves. They can gather the data by deploying their own sensors. And what we've done is we've set up a whole infrastructure which actually helps ensure that infrastructure of data that is being measured by the citizens are part of a platform that gets visualized and deployed on our own website. So you can see the infrastructure here. I'm not sure how visible it is in the little improvised studio that I've got here. But on the left-hand side are what we call the Hollandse luchten sensor kits. So these are the kits that citizens have at their own disposal. And they use LoRa and LoRa gateways to transfer the data onto the servers. Then we have a little process whereby experts are analyzing and calibrating the data, because there is a lot of interesting sort of factors at play here. Let's unpack that a bit more, because there is a whole debate in the Netherlands, and probably in other countries as much so, about who gets to decide what the level of air quality is. Is it the experts who measure everything and know everything, or is that something that you as a citizen can do yourself? We believe a combination of factors might actually be quite good. So the citizens measure the data themselves, and the experts from an organization called RIVM, which is a government liaised organization, is calibrating the data and looking at it with their expert eye to ensure that the level of quality is high enough. And what happens then when you bring it all together is you get a picture collated out of these individual measurements that give you an accurate representation of what the level of air quality is. And what this does is, apart from creating nice visualizations and getting a shared picture of the situation, that shared picture also means that citizens are involved in the whole debate around the level of air quality and are able to understand better what is actually going on. So we're currently at a phase where only a few hundred sensors are being deployed, but we're looking into the next phase right now, and questions arise about the way in which control over this data should be managed. Is it the RIVM, the organization? The funders of this project include the province of North Holland. Are they the ones that should own the data that gets gathered here? There are some fundamental questions around this, and we take inspiration from developments such as the data commons, which is a way of showing and dealing with collective ownership of a group of people. And similar concepts as data trusts are being investigated. And I think these are interesting developments that might make democratize, if you will, the way in which data from all these individual sensors gets managed. So that's a lot of information. Let's go back to our little iceberg and let's look at this foundation. Because as I said, the technology is not just there, it gets designed and built by people, and the build and design process is fundamentally decided through what we identified as 4 layers of the foundation. And what we want to ensure, based on our public mission, is to ensure that that foundation is make sure that the technology stack is inclusive, it's safe, and it's just. Now, what are these 4 layers that I'm talking about? The first one are the starting points and assumptions. So what is the problem that the initiative is intending to solve? When will the problem be solved? Who defines success? And who determines the method by which the problem is resolved? Now, the way we do this in our air quality measurement project is to make sure that we try and get everyone around the table. So the government is involved, the citizens are involved, the experts are involved, and indeed the people from the steel factory who provide some of the pollution in the air is involved in the process as well. And this is an interesting way in which we can create new collaborations, which are more inclusive. And we make clear what we're trying to do in the end as well. I think that's another important point in this foundational layer for the technology. The second one deals with fundamental rights and values. So how does the initiative safeguard fundamental rights, and how is society represented, and how does shared public values resonate in this initiative? And we try and stay focused on the principles that are also the principles for WAF, which is open, fair, and inclusive. So we use open technology, we publish the data openly, and we try and include a diverse representation of citizens in the whole process. Of course, there's the question about the legal framework, and GDPR is respected and all of those aspects. But one of the public values here at stake is also the freedom for individual citizens and the sovereignty of themselves to gain more ownership over their own environment through these air quality measurements. The third layer here is governance and supervision. So our key principle here is society as a whole keeps a grip on digitalization. What you see here is that we're able to apply this model on the digitalization as a whole, but specifically for our project, these are the questions that we're dealing with. What are the different layers of government? Who is accountable to whom? And how is supervision implemented? So in terms of governance for our data project, these are questions that we're currently working through. How are we setting up a data commons type approach whereby citizens gain and keep control over the data that they gather through their own sensors, while at the same time also ensuring that there's a societal benefit by having those aggregate data shared more widely and help influence the policy. And indeed, the questions around the future of the steel factory in this area could be bigger sort of questions that come out of this if we design these processes right. Final point are socio-economic considerations. These questions deal with, for example, what's the financial model? How are risk and profits shared within the society? Is it just the costs that are being put on society, or are the benefits societal as well? And what is the impact in the environment of the technology that we're deploying? So if you think about that within the context of our air quality monitors, what we're looking at is a model whereby these sensor kits at the moment are all financed through our provincial government. And we're asking ourselves questions right now. Is that the sustainable model for the future? What is the relationship between the government and the citizens in this respect? And we're exploring a way in which maybe a different model could make sense, whereby citizens, for example, finance part of their own sensor kits, or maybe use a crowdfunding methodology. We're considering these types of initiatives right now. So once we have these 4 layers worked through, these come together in a design process for the technology. In our case, you could say the design process for the sensor kits themselves. It says that all stakeholders should be involved, and it's clear to what end we're optimizing. Human rights are guaranteed, and public values are respected. Society as a whole keeps a grip on the digitalization, and the financial economic model takes man and planet into account. Women and planet as well, of course. So these processes is where there's a lot of interesting sort of new developments that we're looking into. So in itself, the way in which citizens measure the air quality and share it through the process is a design process in its own right. It's part of the citizen science approach that we're experimenting with here at WAG. But there are other co-creation and key enabling methodologies that ensure that the design process involves everyone. And we really think that that is key to creating the right conditions for how to use and deploy data in society. So once you have the design process cleared up, there's a question of the technology itself. So what is the technology and how does it look like? What we've got here is a model for a technological stack that explains that it's not just one thing, but there are layers that could be identified within the technology that we use. You can identify the application layer and all the other layers, as well as some contact layers. Let me run through them very quickly. The application layer is where we look at aspects like open source. Can applications be made open source so that anyone can check and build the application, and there are no hidden backdoors in this. This is less relevant to our air quality example, but you can imagine lots of situations where applications are a crucial part of the technology stack. In the operating system layer, we look at things like how are people able to control and adapt the operating system on their devices. So when we zoom out from our specific example again and look at ways in which, for example, Android is being managed on your phone, or the way in which some embedded devices are now using quite sophisticated operating systems, how are we able as citizens to control that more? Is one of the questions that we'll look at here. Of course, we've got firmware and we've got specific drivers on our boards for our sensor kits as well. And we try and use as much as possible open technology there, so we're able to change and adapt the drivers on the kits that we deploy in our project. And we try and use as much as possible open hardware in the equipment for the sensor kits, although in practice we see that is still quite underdeveloped. I think there's a lot of potential for sensor kits to be more open, and there's some promising initiatives there. Often we rely on and this is unfortunate, but there could be a trade-off between the quality of the sensor and the model by which the sensor gets developed. So some of the models that are more open do not have the same quality level as some of the sensors that are closed. And I think that's something that we really would like to address as well. Finally, there's a whole piece of infrastructure underneath everything that we do. So in our example, you saw the LoRa gateways, the ways in which the sensor kits transmit the data to the servers and how it gets calibrated and then transferred to another server, to the website. This is all the infrastructure that's lying underneath. And this is the piece that is often the least visible to people. And it's difficult sometimes to see exactly what's going on that level. But it makes it even more important when we rely on this technology as a society, that we understand how the infrastructure has been built up. So finally, in this model, there are a couple of what we call contextual layers. There are layers that are relate to the technology that are relevant on all different layers of the technology. So the first is data and algorithms. People should be able to have control over their own data and the algorithms that gets developed on top of that data. That for us is really key, and what we're trying to do in our Hollandse Luchten project, as I said, is to see how the governance methodologies might be able to give that control back to citizens in a way that they often don't have it in other contexts. Then there's the protocol and standards layer. The protocols and standards should be open. They should be openly developed through an open process, and the results of the process should be open as well, so that anyone can adapt and apply their standards, and there are no locked-in mechanisms at play. And we try and do that as much as possible through our own projects. But it's also a recommendation to other organizations. And of course, as we rely on technology even more and more each day, level of security becomes an important aspect as well, and one that should not be overlooked. Technology should be secure so we can all rely on it safely, especially when it relates to more crucial technology that we all need to rely on. And then the outer layer of all of this is what we call the service layer. And this is often the way in which the citizen interacts with the technology. It's the way in which you, for example, use Spotify as a service, or you use Google Maps maybe on your phone. And often you don't know all the layers or how they are designed underneath. But what we're trying to show with this model is that it's important that this gets changed. So finally, when we get back up, we get back to the citizen perspective again. And we say we can only get a grip on the digitalization if we see the design as a collective responsibility. So let me wrap up there for now. We've seen the model of the roadmap for the digital future and how it applies to our example on air quality. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to discussing this with you.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you, Sander. Unfortunately, Sander can't join us for the Q&A for this session, but he is available for Friday. So if you've got any questions, please put in the chat or in the Docs Plus document, and we'll pick them up and wrap them up on Friday. But for me, that was amazing, because a lot of the questions that are being asked about the work we're all doing in the UK, are replicated in the work in the Netherlands. So it's always worthwhile looking a little bit outside of our own country and our own work, just to see what else is happening. And that way we get to learn and grow. So now it's time for a cup of tea. We're going to have 5 minutes, and then we're back for Northernlands 2, Responsible Data Collaboration. welcome back everyone. Hope you've all had a good cup of tea and a biscuit maybe. And now we're into our final two sessions of the afternoon. First up is Stefania Milan from the University of Amsterdam. She's going to talk about her 4 principles for responsible data collaboration.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stefania Milan, and I work as Associate Professor of Media and Digital Cultures at the University of Amsterdam. Today I have come to you from this beautiful garden, and in preparing this talk I thought I'd rather share with you some nice flowers and greenery instead of yet another white wall that has been accompanying most of our many conference calls and video presentations over the last few months. So I already apologize in advance for any occasional bird or dog or car passing by that might somewhat hinder the audio of this presentation. I'm a sociologist by formation. I've been doing quite some work at the intersection of sociology, political science, media studies, and data science, and mostly a rather interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary work. I'm very passionate in particular about what people do with technology. I consider data as yet another type of meaningful technology. Over the last couple of months, I've dedicated myself in particular at understanding how the COVID pandemic is narrated through data, with a specific focus on those communities and individuals that have been left at the margins. So I'm thinking about those that work, for example, in the informal economy, people with disabilities, but also sex workers, poor families, deprived children, you name it. The many precarious and gig workers that surround our communities, both in the global north and in the global south. What I would like to share with you today, however, are some reflections on how do we try to foster meaningful data collaborations and data collaborations that become precious not only to us, the researchers, not only to the funders, but are directly shaped and become useful also to the communities on the ground, so to the people and those practices that we are directly observing. Today in particular, I would like to share with you some reflections that I did a few years back, and not interested in the context of data or datification of datafied society, with a co-author of mine, Chiara Milan, currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Graz in Austria. With Chiara, we observe, comparing our field notes in various fields, that very often field work on the ground yields to very interesting theory development, smashing data sets. Often, we do not make apparent how the data were collected, and not just from the methodological point of view, but from the epistemological and ontological point of view. And in particular, we fail to make clear how we develop relationships with our research subject, with those that are being researched. For us, and this is the departure of our reflections, communities are not just research subjects if you prefer, they're rather active agents with their own values, preferences, visions, strategies, their own modes and languages of engagement, their very own specific needs. So how can we make sure, we ask back then, that we do not, as researchers, overly shape the research in a way that just benefits us? How can we repurpose the goal and the language, sometimes a very professional language of researchers, the professional language of the funders, of policymakers, in a way that research becomes accessible also to those that are being researched? How do we share our resources? How do we, very importantly, consider the communities on the ground, the individuals on the ground that participate in our research as valuable resources, and consider also the effort that they make to collaborate with us? And how can we build in the research process, the data collaboration in this case, some operational mechanisms that warrant that we listen and are accountable to the communities on the ground. In these reflections, we are very much inspired by the amazing work of a urban sociologist from the United States of America, from Boston in particular, Charlotte Ryan. Charlotte has been working for many, many years with communities on the ground in the United States and at the borders between the United States and Mexico, as well as in Mexico and in other Latin American countries. In a very seminal piece of work, co-authored with one of these activists that she collaborated with, Karen Jeffrey, a union organizer, they reflect on treating, on understanding movements and communities on the ground as skilled learners. So as agents, as individuals, as groups that have the capacity themselves of making sense of their activities and reflect on them. And in this way, they encourage us researchers to leverage this ability of communities on the ground to learn from their own practices and reflect on said practices. It is in this framework that Chiara and I came up with a very simple framework for research called the STRAP framework. In nature, I mean, not in this nature, but in reality, a strap is a piece of clothing usually that connects two items, two parts of a bag, or two parts of a jacket, of a bag to another bag, or you name it. A strap is also very much integral to the objects it tries to connect, the objects it belongs to. So strap for us, in this case, in the research process, stays for, it's an acronym, and I'm going to tell you in a minute what this acronym hides. But we really want to use the analogy of the strap in the real world to connect to research and try to make the case that it's very important to build in these mechanisms that we argue, that we offer to your perusal in order to ensure that data collaborations are meaningful to both sides of the equation. So STRAP stays for, the S stays for sharing, the T stays for translation, the R indicates relevance, the A stays in for accountability, and finally P is for power. So I repeat, sharing, translation, relevance, accountability, and power. So let's now go briefly over these 5 different items that often hide more complex items. So let's start from sharing. Sharing is fairly intuitive, right? I, as a researcher, as the initiator of data collaboration, I might want to share my findings. Very often, however, this sharing is not even written in our research project. It's taken for granted or is simply not really practiced because sharing entails relation building. Data collection as well very often entails relation building, or at least good data collection hides a very careful relation building. However, we tend to really, underscore these parts because these processes are very time consuming. They often come at the very end of the research project or a research process when we are already in the publication phase, or very simply, sorry about this mosquito. Very often we simply equate sharing with sharing simply the publication, a final report, a final, academic article. However, this is really not good enough, we'd argue. For a good data collaboration, sharing entails or has to entail also transparency. What do we mean by transparency? Way to make the research process transparent to the research subjects, and we have to share the research projects from the early on. This connects also to the R letter that is going to come up next, but sharing really means trying to understand in the various phases of the research projects, the various phases of the research collaboration, when can we involve the research subject, also, for example, in determining what are the needs, the desires, and the preferences of the subjects, but also, for example, their research questions. So we have seen the S of sharing. Now let's briefly look at the T of STRAP, the second letter. The T stays in for translation. What do I mean by translation? Well, translation might entail sometimes translating between different languages, between Dutch and Italian, Dutch and English. But what we really try to signal here is much, much deeper and goes to the bottom of relation building. Translation indicates really the conversion, the active effort of converting my agenda into the agenda of someone else, my language, which is often a disciplinary language, a professional language, into the language of the research subject. But it is not a simply mechanical act. It really speaks to relation building once more. And it points to a very, very subtle but very important distinction that we would like to introduce here, which is the very key distinction between research with and research about. Research about is often what we practice. Why? Because we want to research, we want to know more about a specific community, for example. However, the research about presupposes some distance, entails, complete detachment, scientific, very typical scientific objectivity that, make sure that I am the objective observer, the distant observer, the expert observer. Now, we know very well, and I'm not arguing against this, this is very important element of the scientific process, scientific inquiry. However, for meaningful data collaboration to happen, and with data, this is a very specific need because data opens up for an immense amount of possibilities of researching with citizens and research subjects. It's very, very important to go to the bottom of a relationship that tries to involve the citizens into the process. So here we argue really with the T of translation for moving away from researching merely about into researching with. This researching with might not concern every phase of the research project, might not entail or concern every aspect of a research question or a very complex research project. But we do argue that this is very important. It's very important to at least sometimes for some parts of a research project to build in this relation that is different, that gives agency back and power back to those that are actively being researched by us. I'll give you an example. There's a very interesting group of what we may call data activists in Milan, northern Italy, that are involving citizens in data collection about pollutant, so about polluting agents released into the air by, for example, cars or central heatings and other polluting forces. And what they're trying to do is they not only give citizens a little device to install, in their terrace, out of their window, in their garden, but they actually involve the citizens from early on in building these very simple devices, all the way for those citizens that are interested and able to participate, to involving them into the data analysis as such, introducing them to some simple mechanisms of data analysis, and really giving them power into shaping the research relationship and the research project. The project I'm talking about is done by the Off-Topic Lab in Milan, but there are many, many others of this kind throughout the world, in the Global South and in the industrialized world. And now let's move on to the third letter of the strap, relevance. We do have to make sure, we argue, that our research is relevant not only to us as theory developers, as data analysts, as policymakers, those on the powerful side of the equation, those with the expertise, at least in data collection and analysis, but also to those that are being researched. This entails starting from and developing mechanisms and research methods to involved in the research process from day one, even from day zero, really, from the very same research idea that we start with citizens and people on the ground. Interestingly, a few years back at the University of Amsterdam, we hosted a couple of events where we involved a civil society organization from the Amsterdam area in particular into what we call data for the social good experiments. So we played around with an innovative methodology that started from the needs, the needs of the communities on the ground, from the civil society organizations, and we tried to meet midway in making our research questions intersect their research question and needs. And it was a very interesting form of dialogue, very similar to what Charlotte Ryan and Karen Jeffrey experimented in the US for the last 20 or plus years. And I'm sure there are many, many other groups that practice, the effort of making data collaborations relevant also to research subjects. So making sure that our research questions, or at least some of them, get closer to what the research, those who are being researched also care about. And we move now to the fourth letter in STRAP, the A. The A stands for a very, very important component of any research project, accountability. Now, very often as researchers, we understand accountability towards our employers, but more importantly, towards our funders, right? We spend an enormous amount of time with very often very tedious, but nonetheless very important reports back to the founders, where we explain very carefully how the money was accurately spent and how we try to make the research process cost efficient, how we did really the best possible choice given the situation. But we don't spend enough time and enough energies thinking about what we consider a very important aspect of the research process, of meaningful data collaborations, but also meaningful research relations, which is the accountability towards our research subjects. It's similar to it ties into what we name translation. And it concerns being accountable to the research subjects. So making sure, for example, that we try not to harm, very, very important imperative that we derive, for example, from the hacker culture, but also from many other cultures as well, for example, the culture of the medical sciences, but also from the very important need of making sure that we are accountable not just at the very end of the project, again, but throughout the project. For example, we should interrogate ourselves, especially if we do research with people on the ground that might be, for example, human rights defenders or people that do research or activities with communities that are potentially harmed or endangered, by the state or by potential other enemies, if you want. That we make sure that we report back to them, we involve them in the process of also assessing the risks. And this is what we mean by accountability. Assessing the risks of a research project throughout, not only the costs, the financial costs, if you want, we incurred in, but especially the risks in terms of, for example, repression, or the risk of exposing certain practices, or you name it, according to what is your specific research situation of data collaboration that you might have in mind. So what is very important is that this becomes an activity of building bridges, and that these bridges are crossed very often throughout the research process, and that we disclosed what also our risk assessment is, because sometimes the risk or the enthusiasm overshades or shadows the risks also for the people on the ground. And finally, we get to the last letter of our STRAP framework, the P. P stands in for power. What do we mean by power? Well, often we are on the power side of the equation. We are those with the research money, with the research grant to observe people on the ground. Sometimes the power is not even, financial power or anything. It's simply the expertise and the ability to make time and make room for observing practices that people actually lived in or spend their life fighting for. And, we have the distance, that we have the time, we have the resources that allows us to do so compared to the people on the ground. And this, this really brings me to discuss power. This expertise, this time, this money, sometimes results in very severe power imbalances between us and those that we are researching. It's very important to give this power, although very often we cannot really offset it, to give this power adequate consideration and try to, in a way or another, act against it or share resources if we can, but in case of not being able to do so, at least acknowledging it, not just, in the acknowledgement section of an academic paper, but especially when it comes to also designing and implementing the World Research Project. So to sum up, the STRAP framework that stands in for sharing, translation, relevance, accountability, and power. We ask you to keep it into account as a source code ready to use and simple recipe to make sure that our research project and our data collaboration is able to create meaningful connections between the researchers and those being researched, while embedding the research projects into an ongoing process or a would-be process of social change. Thank you for your attention. Have a good rest of the day.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Q&A, which is just me at the moment because Stefania is having trouble joining her internet, although beautiful for recording that great video in her back garden, in our garden there. Unfortunately, she's not been able to join the Q&A, but what for me was there was a really great point that she was making there about how sharing and being open is not just the end product of work and research, it is all the way through the research. And we have a lot of talk of ODI leads about how being able to reach into a project at any point and making it easy for people to join you when you are working is an essential part of how we do research in the open. So the second part of that is how you transfer power and how you deliver. So if you'd like to find out more about that, you can find out all about that on our radically open work at ODI Leads. So if you've got any questions for Stefania, she'll hopefully be joining us during the week and on the wrap-up session on Friday. But now we're really happy to move to our last session for the day. It's Stian Westlake, who's now Chief Executive of the Royal Statistical Society. And over to Stian now.
Hi, my name's Stian Westlake, and I'd like to talk today about the idea of a data moonshot for better and more prolific data collaboration. I've got three particular interests in this. Not long ago, I co-wrote a book about the intangible economy and what needs to make it work. I recently worked as a government advisor on science and innovation policy, but most importantly, I recently joined the Royal Statistical Society as their chief executive. I'm going to first of all kick off by talking a little bit about the economics of data and how that affects what we might do. If you really don't like economics, this is a great time, this being a video conference, to pop out and make yourself a cup of tea. I will probably only take about 2 minutes, so it will probably be a weak cup of tea, but you're forewarned. The story that I tell in Capitalism About Capital is a story of how the world economy, once upon a time, the capital in that economy, the things we used to invest in, used to be physical things you could see and touch, like machines or buildings or plants. That used to represent about 15% of world GDP per year. It was the sinews of the economy 40 years ago. Over the last 40 years, that's changed, and what now makes the world economy work is intangible assets, things you can't see or touch, like R&D, software, brands, supply chains, and of course, data. Data and other intangible assets are kind of funky from an economic point of view. They behave differently from other types of investments for two reasons that are going to be important to us. One is that they have spillovers. So if you're a business and you invest in some data and that data is widely published, other people may benefit from it as well as you. You can't be, your competitors may benefit from it. There is a kind of challenge there if you're relying on self-interested businesses to do your investment. That won't get you all that way. The other thing about intangible assets generally and data in particular is they have what economists like to call synergies. They're really good when you combine them together, which is exactly why data collaboration is so important. If you have a little bit of information, information about a small number of customers or a small amount of epidemiological information, it's not hugely useful. If you can combine that with lots of similar data or lots of different data, suddenly those things can become much more valuable, and that's a general property of these intangible assets. So we're moving from an economy where you could just build your factory and get on with things to an economy where the capital that we all depend on has these characteristics that it will be underproduced if you just rely on businesses to do their thing, and it really matters how you combine it, those synergies. Into this kind of problem typically steps government, and when there are investments that have a lot of these so-called spillovers, you typically expect government to step up to the plate and invest in some of them, and that's what's traditionally happened with, for example, R&D. The British government funds about £10 billion worth of R&D a year. Business backs 20 billion. If government didn't do that funding, the UK's economy would be doing even less well than it currently is. If we think about something like education and training, another really important intangible, in Britain the government spends £90 billion a year on that. So in some areas, our politicians, our political culture have got the idea that investing in these intangibles is something really important to do, something that is worth spending taxpayers' money on if we want a thriving economy and society. But that kind of message hasn't quite got through that much on data. Now, obviously, there is a tradition of governments publishing and providing data. Things like the Ordnance Survey and the tradition of national statistics are really old, in some cases centuries old. But the scale at which that goes on, the scale at which government sees it being worth publishing data, is still pretty small compared to the funding of general research or let alone funding education. And it's something that isn't quite in the mindset of how we talk about politics. So when people talk, we talk about the purpose of the money that we spend on, say, the Office of National Statistics or providing health data, we see it from a functional point of view, but often we lack the bigger picture about how real investment in data and really making that data sing can have a transformative effect on society. So I guess my pitch when I talk to people in politics or to anyone who's a citizen and who cares about these things is to say that if you kind of want to follow the current UK's government advice that we need to build, then data is a really important place to start. And if we're thinking of moonshots, if we're thinking of big, ambitious technical projects that can improve the world, data is a neglected area, but it's an area that deserves a lot more love and a lot more credit and probably a lot more public funding and government attention. One of the places where the RSS has been vocal about this before is through our data manifesto, our kind of manifesto for what should happen in the data world. We published the most recent version last year, and this was kind of a product of the input of our many members who are statisticians and who work with data. And it made, in my opinion, some really important arguments that I think should form part of what you might call a data moonshot. The first and kind of most obvious thing is this idea that we should be investing much more in our data infrastructure as a country. In the same, we're very happy at the moment, or governments are very happy to spend billions of pounds producing academic research papers, some of which are really important, some of which perhaps maybe only get read a few dozen times and are sealed away in an academic journal somewhere. We should be thinking much more about how we invest in data in the same way. And there's a really political message here. I think if you look at something like Anna Powell-Smith's Missing Numbers project or her thoughts about the government data graveyard, there are loads of things that governments, the UK government, should be informing citizens about, should be holding itself to account for, which simply aren't published. So I think the first thing we would call for is, whenever government does something, whenever the law is changed, whenever something important is going on, that we should be pushing for data to be made available, data to be made open about that. But I think this is not just a kind of government probity and government accountability issue. This is also about producing bigger data sets that other people can use and make valuable research contributions to. If I think about things which, I would call moonshots in a sense, really important infrastructural data projects that create lots of new opportunities, I think of something like, if I were in Leeds for this event today, down the road in Bradford, the ACT Early North project, which brings together an absolutely unique set of data on early years performance in Bradford, the youngest city in the UK, which is going to be an absolute treasure trove for public health researchers, for anyone who cares about tackling deprivation and child poverty, and more generally about improving the world. That was, I'm told by the people who run it, incredibly hard to get funding for, because it didn't look like a real academic project, but it wasn't a public health project. Thanks to some far-sighted work by the council and the local NHS, it did get funding, it cobbled it together, and it created something really impressive. But we have a kind of system where funding academic papers, as Ben Goldacre, one of the earlier speakers, to funding academic papers is easier, funding data tools is harder. So I think pushing on those kind of big projects is really important. Another example from my time in government, I was involved in the design of an R&D project called the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And the idea of that was to put together pretty big collaborations between business and researchers. These were typically in the kind of hundreds of millions of pounds range. And the idea was they would improve society, they would generate economic growth, and would be a good thing for the government to do. Lots of the bids for those projects were from kind of industrial companies, people who manufacture things, which are all really valuable. There were few to none that were about building really valuable data resources, whether that's digital twins, public health data sets. And I think this is an area where we really want to see governments being more inspired and thinking about how they can invest and work with businesses, local government, to generate really valuable data resources and to be more ambitious. Those points all kind of come back to this economic idea of spillovers. The reason why we want government spending money on this is because the private sector will invest to a certain extent, but there are public benefits. These data assets are public goods. But I also mentioned that intangibles and data specifically has this kind of idea of synergies, that they're especially valuable when you combine it. And I guess they're the call to action for governments, is to say, well, how do we make those ideal combinations happen? How do we create a world where collaboration works well, happens a lot, and is positive? And I guess there's kind of a few really interesting things that I look at that I think we ought to be doing more of. One is the effective and privacy respectful merging of data sets. So the work that the Oxford Evidence-Based Medicine Data Lab have been doing on the Open Safely platform, which seems to be providing some really valuable insights into the progress of the COVID epidemic, would be one example of that. How do you bring together extremely confidential medical information about people in a way that you can analyse it with respect for confidentiality? The idea that this is a really valuable investment that our research funders, that our government should be backing, seems really important. And if we want to make those synergies work, that's absolutely essential. I guess the second thing, and ODI Leads is a great place to be saying this, is more hubs and programs for building networks to share data. I am a long-standing fan of the work that ODI Leads has been pioneering in this area, and I was thrilled that they did some work with me when I was in government. I think ODI Leads have really blazed a trail here. I think other projects like DataKind UK, that brings together data scientists and charities who often have underutilized data sources or don't know how to collect the right data, is another great example. So the idea of backing hubs, of creating more of them, seems like something that maybe it looks very touchy-feely, but it's hugely important if we want more collaboration in this area. And then I guess the issue which we've heard a bit about already today is how data ethics and standards interact with all of this. And I think if I'm pitching this message at government, the most valuable thing that they should be looking at is how do we create and further and codify the results of a national conversation on data ethics. And thinking with my kind of general science policy hat on, this is something that there are success stories in the past in other fields. So if we think about embryology, for example, which has been, and in many places of the world still is, an incredibly controversial field. I think the UK government in the 1990s was actually pretty forward-thinking there and really fostered a national conversation, got ethicists involved, in some cases funded research, but also brought together discussions, with the result that it created a relatively stable, consensual, ethical framework for how that ran, which was kind of to the advantage of the UK, not just in preventing bad things, but actually in giving stability so that good things could be done. Clearly, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of investment in organisations that look at data ethics, but this is, I think, something that we just need to keep on pushing on and keep on supporting. The other side of this is perhaps the international side, and this conference, the collaboration between the Netherlands and the UK is a really great example. It's great to see the Netherlands reaching out to us in this way. I would hope that the UK government could start reaching out as well and playing a more active role in international efforts to set standards. I think as a British person, that's something where a relatively small investment could yield big benefits, both for the world as a whole and for Britain specifically. And then I guess a further dimension to this, I was briefing for this session, I was asked how we could make data work for the many, not for the few. But when I think of that, I think perhaps we should turn that on its head and say, how can we make data work for minorities, wherever they may be in society, rather than just data that serves the interest of the majority? And particularly at a time when the Black Lives Matter protests have made systematic discrimination so salient in society, the need for granular, specific data that casts light on discrimination and highlights injustices seems more urgent than ever. I think this is an area where there have been historical huge oversights in the part of public data that we've been collecting, and obviously there is a separate issue about the potential for discrimination by algorithms that we use. This strikes me as a huge opportunity where the right kind of intervention could make a huge difference. So I guess it seems to me really clear that there is a moonshot opportunity on data, an opportunity for us as a society to invest more, to build more of a collaborative around this, and to build norms where we use data well and come together effectively around it. I've talked about this to some extent from a public policy point of view, but the public policy is not going to write itself. The politicians are not going to do this themselves, for all the fine words that occasionally we hear about how they really like Bayesian statistics and Monte Carlo simulations, to quote one minister from last weekend. This needs a movement, and it will essentially have to be a movement comprised of people like you who work with data, who know data, and who know the contribution that it can make to a good society. From that point of view, it is really fortunate that data analysis and data analysts are cool at the moment, are in demand, whether that's in business or in government or in wider society, because it gives you and gives us a platform to make those demands, to point out how investment is really important, how this needs to be done in the right collaborative and the right ethical framework. And the time to do this is very much now. So this is a chance to make your voices heard, to really drive these moonshot projects that can change the world, and to push for better understanding and more collaboration. So I think this is exciting to be here, and I look forward to seeing what we can do next.
Thanks, Stian, and welcome to the Q&A. Thanks very much for that, very enlightening. And if anyone does get a chance, if you'd like to read Capitalism Without Capital, it is a great read. Recognise a lot of the things that Stian talks about there in the way that ODI Leads works. So lots to cover, but I've got a couple of questions, and if anyone else would like to join in with questions as we go, I'll try and pick them up. But what we're talking about is decentralized data, distributed networks to answer questions and generate value and it's hard to measure that. And it's also a big challenge to the centralizing instinct of centralized government, of central government. So how can we help them understand that to give things away, they'll get more back?
I mean, it's a really tough question, because governments, and British government in particular, loves to keep things kind of close to its chest, and that's kind of an understandable instinct for politicians. They're worried about being criticised. So I think the best way you can do this is the kind of model that I think I associate with ODI Leads and other people like you, which is to do things, do them well, and then show them off to the world. So it's that kind of proof of concept, getting things out, even if they're quite small, that is that's the way to do it. Make them jealous of what you've done, so that they are incentivized to give you more control.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen with the COVID-19 crisis is that actually people start to get it. If we do want to collaborate quickly, the only way to do it is in the open, because people can join in at their speed, and we don't have to have long engagement sessions to make it happen. And who's got time for 3-hour conference calls to talk about a governance process? For actually, what we need to do is to be talking about the questions we want to ask about the data, not about how we share it in the first place. Good. So, and the second bit is, so I talk about killing reports, as ODI Leads is a report killer, because who reads all of the report? Who's got time to write a report, and who's got time to check it to make it sure it's right? And then usually it's based on data that's 18 months out of date, and then by the time it's published and read, you might be 2-3 years down the line. So, and it's a similar question. So how do we fund teams that can build tools to give us answers, rather than write reports that give views and opinions?
So I think, to be optimistic about this, you might be kind of going with the grain of where certainly sort of science and R&D funding in the UK is going at the moment, certainly the public side of funding, because that idea, exactly what you said, of funding a team rather than saying, here's the output I want, go and do precisely this and nothing else, that idea I think is getting more popular. It's a bigger part of the government's recent R&D roadmap they published, I think was actually pretty positive on that. I think people are looking at particular kind of, in the world of academic research, things like the lab of molecular biology at Cambridge, which kind of follows that kind of approach, and they're saying, you know what, that sometimes works. So I think the question would be, how do you tell that story, which is kind of gaining traction in the world of science and research, where a lot of government funding goes, and explain how it works for data, which is obviously not exactly the same, but is kind of your next door neighbours.
Absolutely. And then you've just taken a new job, haven't you? Is it day one or day two?
It's almost sort of day -3. So like Thursday is my proper first day, but I'm easing myself in.
Fantastic. And just tell us about some of the things you'd like to do in the new role.
Well, so at the Royal Statistical Society, we are our mission is to promote the good use of data and evidence for the public good, to support statisticians and anyone who works with data, and to really help that community in the public interest. So I think from our point of view, we're very keen to work with organisations like ODI Leads and really anyone who's taking part here to see how we can push this agenda on. I think it's a really important time for the world of data and the world of statistics specifically. I think that was the case even before the current pandemic has kind of made things particularly salient for people. But I think there's a huge opportunity and a huge amount of public good that can be done.
Fantastic, and we're really looking forward to working with you in whatever happens next, and however we map whatever happens next. I'm sure there's going to be people asking us, as well as where's the data, what does it mean? So I'd like to say thank you again for joining us. It's been a really great day. We're going to finish off now, but we'd like to say thank you to all the speakers for today. Thank you to Stiam. Thank you to ODI HQ. Thank you to the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Thank you, and we'll see you all tomorrow.